Hey everyone, welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be taking a look at this final pre-election 2024 anti-trans risk assessment map by Erin Reed. You can find it on her blog, Erin in the Morning.
It's a great resource.
It really is, and I think if you're trying to
Yeah.
kind of wrap your head around the current political landscape, especially as it relates to, trans folks in the U.S., it's definitely a must-read.
Yeah, and I think what's really important to note is that Erin has been doing this for 5 years now. She's been tracking anti-trans legislation for 5 years, and this map is the culmination of some serious in-depth research. She's read over 1,100 anti-trans bills just in 2023 and 2024 alone, not to mention countless hours of hearings and engaging directly with activists on the ground.
Yeah, it's really not just like a surface level glance at the headlines. This is like really serious work.
Yeah, and it's it's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
You know what she does that's really important? And she goes beyond just cataloging these bills. She analyzes the legislative trends. She connects them to the broader political climate. And she ultimately assesses the level of risk that trans people face in each state.
Right.
And she breaks that down specifically for adults and for youth.
And so that's what we're really hoping to unpack today. Like what are the factors that actually determine a state's risk level, and how do those differ for trans adults versus trans youth?
So when we're assessing risk for young people,
Yeah.
one of the biggest red flags is the presence of bans on gender-affirming care.
Right.
This is a critical issue because denying young people access to appropriate medical and psychological support can have, really devastating consequences for their physical well-being.
Yeah, and it's not just about healthcare, though. There are also these bathroom bans and restrictions on what's often called social transition.
Right, so social transition refers to the steps that a trans person might take to live in accordance with their gender identity, like changing their name, their pronouns, their clothing. In some states are really trying to legislate these very personal expressions out of existence, which can be incredibly damaging, especially for young people who are just beginning to explore and understand their identities.
Yeah, it just sounds like these policies are really aimed at controlling how trans youth live their lives, like even dictating the most basic aspects of self-expression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when we shift focus to adults, we see a whole other set of legislative attacks. So, bans on gender-affirming care, similar to what we see with youth, but also crackdowns on drag performances, pride events, and even attempts to make it harder for trans people to update their legal documents to reflect their gender identity.
Hold on, restrictions on legal documents. That sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
It is. Some states are making it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for trans people to change their driver's licenses or birth certificates, forcing them to carry documentation that doesn't match who they are.
Yeah, isn't that like a form of forced outing?
Absolutely. It outs trans people every time they have to show ID, putting them at risk of discrimination, harassment, or even violence. And in some extreme cases, there are even laws aiming to completely erase legal recognition of trans identities altogether.
That's deeply concerning. It's like they're trying to make it illegal to be trans.
Yeah. It's a chilling trend, and what's even more concerning is the fact that the overall national risk level has jumped from moderate to high since the last assessment.
Wow, that's a big jump. What's driving this heightened risk?
It's impossible to ignore the impact of the 2024 election cycle. Anti-trans rhetoric has become a central theme, particularly within certain campaigns.
Yeah, it feels like this rhetoric has really moved from like the fringes to the mainstream political stage, and it's creating this climate of fear and hostility towards trans people.
Right, and
the potential implications of certain political figures gaining more power are significant, especially given their past statements and actions supporting policies that directly target the trans community.
And even if, the political winds shift in a different direction, this isn't an issue that's just going to disappear overnight. We've seen anti-trans legislation push through budget negotiations and other, legislative maneuvers, regardless of who's in control.
Right. The fight for trans rights is a long game, and we need to be prepared for the challenges that lie ahead.
So let's dive into the specifics of Erin's risk assessment map. She breaks it down into these different risk categories, and frankly, some of them are downright terrifying, starting with the do not travel category.
Yeah.
Florida and Texas right now are the two states that fall under this advisory.
Do not travel is a strong statement. What's happening in these states that warrants such a warning?
So in Florida, we've seen the implementation of these incredibly broad bathroom laws. Essentially, trans people can be arrested for simply using the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. Wow. And it goes beyond just restrooms. They're also targeting driver's licenses and even accusing trans people of fraud for what they call misrepresenting their gender.
It sounds like they're actively criminalizing trans identity.
In a way, yes. And Texas is arguably even worse. The Attorney General there is barring trans people from updating their driver's licenses even if they have a court order to do so.
Wow.
They're also creating a database of people trying to update their documents, which feels incredibly invasive and creates a real sense of fear for the trans community.
And then there's that horrifying ordinance in Odessa, Texas, offering a $10,000 bounty for reporting trans people using certain bathrooms. A bounty. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
And what's even more disturbing is that these policies don't just impact residents. If you're traveling through these states, you're also at risk. So that do not travel warning is something to take very seriously.
It sounds like trans people are facing an existential threat in these states. Their very existence is being challenged. Their safety is constantly in jeopardy.
And that's why understanding this map is so important. It's not just about staying informed. It's about taking action to protect ourselves and our communities.
So where do we go from here? We've covered the most extreme category, do not travel. What's the next level of risk?
So next up, we have the worst states category. And unfortunately, it's a long list. We're talking Alabama, Idaho, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Oklahoma, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Utah.
Worst states doesn't exactly inspire confidence. What makes these states so dangerous for trans people?
Well, in addition to the bathroom bans we've already discussed, which are present in several of these states, there's a concerted effort to erase the legal rights of trans individuals.
Can you give us some specific examples of this legal erasure? Like what kinds of policies are we talking about?
So, for instance, in states like Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, they're enacting legislation that makes it virtually impossible for trans people to change their birth certificates. This means they're forced to live with documents that don't reflect their true identities, putting them at risk of discrimination and harm.
And you mentioned earlier that adult gender-affirming care is also under attack.
Yes, sadly, that's a growing trend. In many of these states, we're seeing moves to ban or severely restrict access to gender-affirming care, even for adults. For instance, Florida has enacted policies that effectively ban the majority of gender-affirming care, and Idaho is barring state funding for such care. It's a frightening prospect for trans adults who rely on these treatments for their well-being.
This is all so much to take in. I think we need to pause here and come back to this in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it is. It's heavy stuff, for sure. And it can feel pretty overwhelming, to hear about all these attacks on trans rights. But I think it's also important to remember that, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a spectrum of risk across the country. And some states are actually taking meaningful steps to protect trans people.
Yeah, that's such a vital point, I think. It's easy to get caught up in the negativity, but it's crucial to recognize that there are places where trans people are finding support and acceptance.
Moving on from the worst states category then, what's the next level of risk we need to understand?
So we move into what Aaron Reed calls the high-risk states. And these are states that have definitely passed some concerning anti-trans laws, but they haven't gone to the same extremes as those in the worst category. So we're looking at places like Arkansas, Iowa, Indiana, Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Ohio, South Carolina, and West Virginia.
Okay, so they're not exactly hayvays for trans folks, but maybe there's like a glimmer of hope. It's a mixed bag, for sure. Some states in this category have enacted specific policies that raise serious concerns. For instance, Missouri and West Virginia have banned gender-affirming care for incarcerated adults, which is a particularly vulnerable population.
Wow. Denying health care to people who are already in a difficult situation, that's just cruel.
It is. And what's especially troubling is that both of these states have seen even more extreme bills proposed in their recent legislative sessions, indicating a possible escalation of anti-trans sentiment.
So it's not necessarily getting better.
Right. And then you have a state like Nebraska, where the governor issued an executive order that essentially undermines legal recognition for trans people. It's a blatant attempt to erase their identities.
Yeah.
And deny their basic rights.
It seems like these states are finding creative and often insidious ways to discriminate against trans people.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the insidious impact of so-called religious refusal laws, which we see in states like Arkansas. These laws essentially give healthcare providers a license to discriminate, allowing them to deny care to LGBTQ+ individuals, based on their personal religious beliefs.
That's incredibly dangerous. It creates a system where someone's access to healthcare is dependent on the personal biases of their doctor.
Exactly.
Wow.
So even though these high-risk states might not have the same level of outright bans as the worst states, they're still creating a hostile and often dangerous environment for trans people.
It's a reminder that oppression can take many forms, and it's not always as overt as like a blanket ban or a discriminatory law.
Exactly. It's often a combination of subtle policies, discriminatory practices, and a general climate of intolerance. That makes life incredibly difficult for trans individuals.
Okay, so we've got do not travel, worst states, and now high-risk states. What comes next on this spectrum of risk?
The next category is moderate risk, and this includes states like Alaska, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Dakota, and Wyoming.
And what makes these states moderate risk as opposed to high risk? What are the defining factors here?
So these states generally fall into one of two categories. Either they've passed a handful of laws, specifically targeting trans adults, or they focus their attacks primarily on trans youth.
So is it fair to say that targeting trans youth is often a precursor to targeting trans adults? Is there like a pattern there?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes.
History has shown us that states that go after trans youth often end up introducing legislation targeting adults later on. It's a slippery slope, and it's incredibly worrisome.
Yeah, it's like they're testing the waters,
Wow.
seeing how much they can get away with before expanding their attacks to the entire trans community.
That's a good way to put it. And we see this play out with these don't say gay provisions that have been popping up across the country.
You know, at first glance, those laws seem like they're just about limiting what can be taught in schools. But it sounds like their impact goes much deeper than that.
Absolutely. They create this chilling effect that extends far beyond the classroom, contributing to a culture of fear and silence around LGBTQ+ issues.
Can you give us a specific example of how these don't say gay laws are playing out in real life?
Well, look at what happened in Georgia recently. A teacher was fired for simply reading a book with a character that could be interpreted as transgender.
Wow.
It's a stark example of how these laws are being used to censor any mention of LGBTQ+ identities, even in the most benign contexts.
It's creating a situation where simply acknowledging the existence of trans people is seen as a threat. It's heartbreaking.
And it has this ripple effect throughout the community. When educators are afraid to even mention LGBTQ+ issues, it sends a message to trans students that they are not welcome, that they are not safe.
So even a moderate risk state isn't exactly a safe haven for trans folks, especially young people?
Definitely not. It's important to understand that risk exists on a spectrum. And even in states that might seem relatively progressive, trans people are still facing significant challenges and discrimination.
So far, we've covered the states that pose the greatest threat to trans people. But you mentioned earlier that some states are actually taking positive steps to protect trans rights. So let's shift gears now and talk about those states. What does the other end of the spectrum look like?
So thankfully, there are states that are actively working to create a more just and equitable environment for trans people. These are what Erin Reed calls the low-risk states. And while they haven't necessarily gone above and beyond to protect trans rights, they've at least refrained from actively targeting trans adults with discriminatory legislation.
Okay, so give us the rundown. Which states fall into this low-risk category?
So the low-risk group includes Arizona, Delaware, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin.
Okay, so what's the overall vibe in these states? Are they actively working to create a more inclusive environment for trans people?
Well, it's a bit complicated. Some of these states, like Arizona and Virginia, have unfortunately passed anti-trans policies that specifically affect youth, but for various political or social reasons, haven't yet extended those policies to adults.
So while they might be considered low risk for adults, there's still a level of concern there, especially for trans youth.
Absolutely. But then you have states like Michigan and Nevada that have taken significant steps to implement strong non-discrimination policies. These policies offer some level of protection for trans people in areas like housing, employment, and public accommodations.
That's encouraging to hear. It sounds like there's a real commitment to equality in those states.
Yeah. However, even in these more progressive states, there are still persistent issues, particularly when it comes to healthcare equity and the protection of incarcerated trans individuals. These are areas where even the low-risk states have room for improvement.
It's a reminder that the fight for trans rights is ongoing, and there's always more work to be done, even in the states that are making progress.
Absolutely. It's not enough to simply avoid enacting discriminatory laws. True equality requires proactive measures to address systemic inequalities, and ensure the well-being of all trans people.
Okay, so we've explored the low-risk states. Now let's talk about the states that are truly leading the way in terms of trans rights. You mentioned earlier that some states have gone above and beyond to create a safe and welcoming environment for trans individuals. Tell us about those states.
Now we get to the heartening part of our conversation. These are the most protective states, and they've truly set a high bar for trans inclusivity. We're talking about California, Colorado, Connecticut, D.C., Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, Maine, Minnesota, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington.
Wow, that's quite a list. What are these states doing differently that makes them so much more protective of trans people?
So these states have not only refrained from enacting discriminatory laws, but have actively implemented policies and practices that affirm and support trans identities. For instance, many of these states have comprehensive health insurance laws that cover a wide range of gender-affirming care, including hormone therapy surgery and mental health services.
So they're not just saying trans people are welcome, they're actually backing it up with concrete policies that ensure access to essential health care.
Exactly. And it goes even further. Several of these states, like Colorado, Hawaii, Maryland, and Washington, have taken the additional step of offering refugee protections for trans people fleeing from those more hostile states with anti-trans laws.
That's incredible. So they're not just protecting their own residents, but offering a safe haven for trans people from across the country.
Yeah, they're living up to their values and creating a model for what true trans inclusivity can look like. And what's particularly noteworthy is that these states are also the most likely to push back against any potential federal anti-trans regulations that might come down the line, especially if we end up with a federal administration that's less supportive of trans rights.
So they're acting as like a bulwark against this rising tide of anti-trans sentiment we've been discussing.
Exactly. They're demonstrating that it's possible to create a society where trans people are not only tolerated, but celebrated and supported.
It's inspiring to see that amidst all the negativity and fear, there are pockets of hope and progress.
And it's crucial to highlight those positive examples, not only to celebrate the advancements that have been made, but also to inspire continued action and advocacy in other parts of the country.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the most hostile states to the most protective, I think it's time to take a breather and come back to wrap things up. In the final part of our deep dive, wow, we went from do not travel warnings to states that are like rolling out the welcome mat. It's a lot, and it definitely leaves me with more questions than answers.
It's a complex issue. There's no easy solution, no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing these challenges facing the trans community. It really has these legal and political, social, cultural dimensions.
And I think it's easy to get caught up in like the headlines and the political rhetoric. But at the end of the day, this isn't just about, these abstract debates. It's about real people's lives.
Right. Behind every statistic, behind every policy, behind every court case, there are individuals who are trying to navigate their lives. Trying to find a place where they can be themselves, where they can feel safe, where they can feel accepted.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that. What does this all mean for you, the listener? We've thrown a lot of information your way, but how can you actually use this knowledge to make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, it's about awareness. It's about understanding the nuances of this issue, recognizing the different levels of risk across the country, and seeing how these policies are impacting trans people on a personal level.
Right.
Knowledge is power. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to advocate for change.
Absolutely.
So this map is not just about raising awareness. It's also about empowering people to take action, whether that's making informed decisions about where to live or where to travel or how to support trans people in your community.
It's about being mindful, being intentional, and being an ally.
Exactly. And that can take many forms. It can be as simple as educating yourself and others about trans issues, using your voice to speak out against discrimination, or supporting organizations that are fighting for trans rights.
Right. It's about recognizing that this isn't just a trans issue. This is a human rights issue.
Absolutely. It's an issue that requires everyone's attention, everyone's action. We can't afford to be complacent, to think that this doesn't affect us, or that it's someone else's problem to solve.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a challenge. Given what you've learned today, how can you turn this knowledge into action?
What steps can you take, no matter how small, to create a more inclusive and welcoming world for trans people?
Yeah, it could be something as simple as starting a conversation with a friend, or donating to a trans-led organization,
Yeah.
or speaking up when you witness discrimination.
Every action makes a difference. Every voice makes a difference.
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't a conversation that ends when the deep dive is over. It's an ongoing dialogue that requires our continued attention and commitment.
We're all on this journey together, and the destination is a world where everyone can live authentically and freely.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.